Hello folks, Dick Fairburn here. Gray, rainy day in the People's Republic of Illinois. Seems like I have to shoot under whatever kind of conditions I can get my hands on lately. Today I want to talk about lever action rifles again. Passion of mine. And you know, the popularity of lever action rifles and carbines just continues to grow. More and more models are coming on the market every year. Different variations, different calibers. Some of this is nostalgia, no doubt. Americans love guns of the Old West. But lever guns are eminently practical for both self-defense and hunting. And especially in places like the People's Republic of Illinois, where semi-auto rifles have now been banned. You can keep what you have, but nobody can buy any new ones. And we've seen more and more states come on board that way. And just recently, the Supreme Court of the United States turned down a case to try to overturn that. We're not sure why. They gave us some hints that it eventually will be overturned. But for the foreseeable future, probably at least a year or more, we're still going to see these semi-auto bans in place in a lot of blue states. In these states, the lever action carbine is still a very viable alternative. I'll show you the ones from my collection, and I'm not a collector. When I have weapons, they to me are tools, not toys. This is really the first pistol caliber carbine, now not this one in particular. The Winchester 73, maybe even the 66 before it, but that was a rimfire cartridge. But the 73 came out in 44-40 or 44 Winchester centerfire, 38 Winchester centerfire, and eventually other calibers. Replaced later, superseded by the 1892, a stronger and smoother action, and I have a couple of those. These were the first pistol caliber carbines, and nowadays they're not chambered for those cowboy loads of the 44-40 from the black powder days. They're chambered for modern revolver cartridges like the 357 Magnum, the 44 Magnum, the two most common. And if you want to look around, they're available in 45 Colt. Rossi makes a 454 Casull, which is a beast of a very lightweight carbine. And a buddy of mine who carried a 41 Magnum for his whole career as a cop, he had one made years ago from a Marlin 357 Magnum, rebarreled. But now, both Marlin has run some 41s in the past, and I believe Henry still has them available. So you can get 41 Magnum if you're a lover of that intermediate Magnum revolver cartridge. For most effective use, there are some accessories that you can put on these things to make them even more effective. Sights, lights, things of that sort. So stick around. I'm going to tell you how to make these things even more effective for home defense, whether or not you have semi-autos available to you in your state. If you're looking to buy a new lever action carbine, you're ahead of the game, because some of the upgrades that I'm going to show you in this video and a couple more down the road, you can find them on factory made lever actions now. So you don't have to upgrade, you just have to find what you're looking for. And it's interesting to look ahead and look at the tactical lever action rifles that are on the market now. And they're both in pistol calibers like 357 and 44. Or you can have them in rifle calibers, more hunting grade calibers like 30-30 or 45-70. But in some respect, these tactical lever actions are almost becoming the new age AR-15. These are kind of like Barbie dolls for dudes. There's no limit to how you can accessorize them. You can screw on way more things than are really practical, and way more things than you really want to lug around if you want to spend the money and get that kind of technology. What I'm looking here is how to upgrade a more traditional type lever action, one that you may already have, one that maybe is sitting in the closet from your grandpa, that you can turn into quite an effective lever action carbine for either self-defense or even backwoods defense against bears or boars, or hunting medium game out to reasonable ranges. Now, most of the things I'm going to suggest to you are really pretty simple do-it-yourself projects. Some of them may require drill and tapping on some models, and that may be more than you want to try to get into. But that's a fairly simple gunsmith job that's not going to cost you a lot of money. In my humble opinion, the most important thing you can do to any of these carbines, whether they be top ejectors like the Model 92 or 73 from Winchester or modern equivalents, or the solid tops, which give you much more latitude in the way you can mount sights, scopes, red dots, and things like that. The most simple thing you can do, and in my opinion the most effective thing you can do, is to upgrade the sights that come on these. Most of these older rifles, most of the traditional style lever actions, come with a barrel mounted buckhorn rear sight. And I can show you an example of where this sight goes. It comes in the mid barrel. I have a fold up rear sight on this, and I do that simply because this rifle has tang sights, aperture sights that I use. I wanted to fill the dovetail. You can either get a blank of blued steel to go in there, or often I just put a fold down rear sight on there. So it fills the blank and it's there if for some reason I need it. But so many of these came with what were called buckhorn sights. And I'll show you a close-up of a buckhorn. They have big ears on them. They look kind of odd. Traditionally, the front sights are generally bead sights, a round bead with a kind of a sculptured base on it. And that bead and buckhorn, while it can work perfectly well, in my experience, it's slower and it's less accurate. Now, they may be more traditional, they may be more cool looking for that kind of weapon, but not my idea of maximum effective use. And for that, you need some kind of an aperture sight, either a tang, a top mounted, and a square post, which is called a patridge sight. And the best yet are some patridge sights that have high visibility things that can really catch your eye in bad lighting conditions. I think the first thing we have to talk about when we're talking about aperture sights, what many people will call peep sights, is that a lot of people nowadays don't understand the proper use of these aperture sights. They see them on small bore competition rifles, they see them on target grade equipment, and they think they may be very precise, but they're very slow to use. And if they're set up properly, an aperture sight is one of the fastest ways to get good sighting on a carbine, as well as they're very rugged and they can be perfectly accurate. Now, those small hole peep sights that we see on those target rifles, they're slow to use because of that small hole. And that small hole is kind of like stopping down the lens on a camera. It stops down your eye, it gives you better focus on the front sight, and that makes it a good target grade sight. But if you stop and think about it, if you have military experience with M16, M4s, if you look at M1 carbines, M1 Garands, even back to the Springfield 03 A3 version that had a peep sight, the Western military organizations have used aperture sights for a very long time. That open rear sight mounted out on the barrel is really more of a communist block kind of thing on the AK-47s, AKMs. Because their shooters are not really trained for precision use. Those things are kind of hoses meant to be used on full automatic, where we still train riflemen. But if you take that aperture sight and instead of that little tiny pinhole in the center, you open that up to a larger hole, especially up to what some of us call a ghost ring, a term I will steal from Jeff Cooper, I believe, was the first to use it. What you've got is a rear sight that essentially disappears in your eyesight. There's a fuzzy ring there, but you just ignore it. You focus your eye on the front sight, you ignore the rear sight, and trust that your eye and your brain will center the tip of that post in that ring for you. And it does. The easiest way to teach people how to use an M4 carbine is focus on the front sight, put the tip of the sight on the target where you want to hit it, and just ignore the rear sight altogether. And they very quickly are making very fast, very accurate hits with that kind of training. So the key to using an aperture sight is to ignore the rear sight. It should be a fuzzy ring in your peripheral vision. Here's an example of, this is a Williams receiver mounted aperture sight. This is a Browning 1886 4570 carbine. There's a screw-in aperture. Now this one in here right now for demonstration purposes has a fairly large hole. You see a lot of real estate out there. This even has a brass ring, and I'll show you some close-ups of this if you want to catch that. But really, for hunting, for self-defense use out to say 100 yards or so, what you really want to do is screw the aperture out and put it in a drawer somewhere. This threaded ring becomes a ghost ring sight. That when it is that close to your eye, it's there, you ignore it, you concentrate on the front sight, and it's very fast to use, and it gives you a lot of real estate. I will talk about optics as we go along, but these top ejecting models like the 86 Winchester Action, the 73, the 92, even the 95, the more modern Winchester that will take rimless bottleneck cartridges like 30-06, they're not great for optics. You got to mount your optics up here ahead of the action, or you're going to mount them offset. I had a buddy who inherited a Winchester 94 in 30-30 with the offset scope mount. And we spent most of an afternoon and probably a couple of boxes of ammo trying to get that thing sighted in for him. And it was a Vortex scope, so it was quality optics, but it just, I'm not sure if the mount was not solid, letting things flex around. We could just never quite get that thing dialed in. So eventually, he decided to take the scope off, ordered an aperture sight, and he's going to hunt with it that way because his shots are probably going to be 100 yards or less, and they'll do an adequate job for him. If you want optics, the modern solid top rifles, and so we're looking at the Marlins, Henrys, the Smith & Wesson 1854 that came out a couple of years ago. Those are solid top side ejectors. You can mount optics on them so much easier. And myself, optics on a lever action just somehow don't seem to fit. I spent a lot of time in Wyoming carrying one of these in a saddle scabbard on a horse, and optics would have gotten in the way. Plus they're more fragile, they're more expensive, and for the range that you can use these at effectively, I think sights will do an adequate job. As long as you've got aperture, patridge, sight combination, as opposed to that old buckhorn and bead, which if you can use the buckhorn and bead, that's fine. But I'll tell you, when I was doing cowboy action shooting, and I won one of the state, the annual match championship for our club, and I did that because I was so fast and accurate with a carbine. A lot of guys could outshoot me with the revolvers, but they asked me, said, "How are you doing that so quickly with a carbine?" Because we just can't seem to keep up with you. And this was the carbine. This is the Browning 92 action, chambered for 357 Magnum. I had a tang sight. I had a blade patridge front sight. It's super fast. It's super accurate, especially at those cowboy distances out to 75 yards or less. Because we did have some carbine-specific matches where we'd have a kind of a rattle battle, 3 or 4 guys knocking down steel plates out there at 75 or 100 yards. I'd go for the long targets. I could shoot fast and accurate with this. I put on a kind of demo for these guys and showed them how to truly shoot an aperture sight. And once I did that, I didn't win as much anymore because they could outshoot me with a revolver already, and they were now keeping up with me with the carbine. But they understood now how fast a good aperture sight could be. Okay, so how do you get one of these aperture sights on your carbine? In the old days, if you wanted one on a 92, 73, 86 Winchester, it basically had to be a tang sight, and that put it back here, even closer to your eye. And the closer the aperture is to your eye, the more effective it is for speed in terms of using it as a ghost ring. These two Browning 92s, they were made in the 80s, I believe. My cowboy buddy in Wyoming bought 2 of them when they came out. They made them in 357 and 44 Magnum. And they made just a few thousand of them, and I think 1,000 of those were high grade with nickeled receivers and pretty fancy stuff. He just bought the basic ones, and he's like me, Browning puts a high gloss finish on them, which I didn't like, and so he sanded it off, oil finished them, and he looked around and found some original Marbles tang sights. They had not been made for a long time. This one in particular is spring loaded. You put it down like that, and when you're ready to go, and I'll show you close-ups of all this stuff. When you're ready to go, you just touch it and it pops right up and where you need it. It's got a decent size aperture in it now, but it's that insert will screw out, and there again you can just use that hole as an even bigger ghost ring sight. This particular one has a dovetail for the front sight, which makes things a whole lot easier. So a tang sight was the original way to get the aperture on these old rifles. It has become so popular now that both Lyman and Marbles, who were two of the biggest tang sight makers in the day, both of them have tang sights back on the market now, and they're reasonably priced. You know, they go for like $125, which is what you're going to pay for a good peep sight of almost any kind. So they can be mounted on here now. There are some disadvantages to tang sights. They're a little bit more fragile if they get bumped. You have to drill and tap one hole in the tang to get them mounted. They can interfere with your grip style. If you shoot with a thumb over grip, that's going to interfere with you a little bit. And if you buy one of the newer Winchesters, and Winchester has the 73, the 92, the 86 available as new weapons. They're not made by Winchester. They're made by Moroku in Japan, who also made these Brownings. They now have a sliding tang safety, and that safety will get in the way of mounting a tang sight. Now they can be removed, but if you're going to mount a tang sight, you have to do that. So tang sight is an option. It's a reasonably priced option nowadays compared to these. To find some of these old Marbles as collector items on eBay or Gunbroker or someplace, you may pay as much for an authentic Lyman or Marbles antique sight as you almost would for the rifle itself. So going with the antiques is not an economically viable way to do things. The next way to do it is a barrel-mounted peep. Marbles makes these. I'm not sure who else, but they just replace that rear sight. It gives you a circle to use as a sight, but as I said, the closer to your eye, the better for that aperture, and moving it out there, they'll work, but it's hard to get that kind of ghost ring image. You really have a circle and a post that you kind of have to spend more time lining up. So while they're plenty accurate and they're a very inexpensive way to get that aperture rear sight, in my opinion, they're not the best option. The other way to do it is to mount it on the bolt, and in particular the Winchester 71, which is a variation of the big 86 action for the 348 Winchester cartridge. It came drilled and tapped for an aperture sight that mounted on the bolt. So when that bolt cycled back and forth, the peep came back and forth with it, but it was very solid and very easy to use. Skinner Sights makes a bolt mounted sight for the big 86 action, like my 4570, and that might be what I go to, but they do not make it for the smaller 92. There's just not a lot of real estate here. However, I believe it's the Rossi 92 copies that are made nowadays. They have a safety that's mounted up here on the bolt, kind of a little rotary switch for putting a safety on. There's a website called Steve's Guns, G-U-N-Z, I believe. That safety can be removed, and they have available a peep sight, aperture sight, which will replace that round safety device and give you a really nice bolt-mounted aperture. But that's only available for that Rossi 92 with that kind of unusual safety on the bolt. XS sights, or XS used to be, I believe, XS Outdoors, they make a bridge mount sight that bridges over the bolt on these kind of open top actions and screws down on the outer edges of the receiver. Now this will work on a Winchester 94 angle eject, which is the current production of the Winchester 94. And those date back to the 80s. They are drilled and tapped. The action has been modified to kick those cases out more to the side, so you can mount an optic over those particular open top actions. So the 94 Angle Express. And XS makes a bridge sight which will screw down on those drilled and tapped holes where the scope mounts go and give you a really neat looking and very excellent aperture sight there. They also have that bridge mount for the 86, but it's not drilled and tapped. It sits at the very rear of the receiver, and you have to drill and tap 2 holes to do that. So that's a little bit of minor gunsmithing work. So the solid top receivers, like the Henry, like the Smith & Wesson, like the Marlins, that are so good with optics are also better for mounting aperture sights as well. They simply screw down into those holes that are already there for scope mounts. Those sights that screw onto those mounting holes on a solid top receiver rifle, those are the best, those are the simplest, the least expensive. So that's really the best way to put an aperture sight on one of those carbines. And those kind of sights can be had from several different sources. Skinner Sights is one that makes a lot of different variations. Ranger Point Precision, the XS sights that I've mentioned, and probably several more that I'm not even aware of. So if you've got a closed top, 357, 44, or even into the bigger rifle cartridges like 30-30 or 45-70, the best way to put an aperture sight on them, simply screw it down to those holes that are already drilled and tapped in the top of the receiver. So if the solid tops are easier for upgrading on the sights, why would you want one of these open top carbines? Well, there are several reasons really. Maybe you already have one. I obtained both of these, the 357 and 44, from my cowboy buddy out in Wyoming. He mounted these old antique peep sights that worked so well. I talked him out of the 357 because he hardly ever used it. He had a rack on the dash of a 1979 Ford pickup he used for hunting and fishing outfitting, and that 44 carbine rode in the rack on that Ford pickup for, he said, probably 300,000 miles or more. I think he went through a couple different engines in that truck, but the rifle was always there. And I could never talk him out of that 44, so I had to wait for him to pass away. And a year or so ago he passed away, and my inheritance was the match to this 357 in the 44 Magnum carbine. That's why I have them. And frankly, I think the 92 action, or the larger 86 with these twin locking lugs, designed by John Moses Browning. That's why Browning brought them out as a kind of a tribute to him a number of years ago. I think these are the smoothest action and one of the shortest throws. And for people like me with short arms, I can flick that thing fully forward, fully back, easier than a lot of the other rifles. So I think they're smooth. I think they're great. Rossi makes them. Pedersoli, I believe, makes some 86 style and maybe some 92 size carbines. They're out there, and you may already have your hands on one. So they're worth it to get an aperture mounted on them because of their simplicity and because of their just rugged, reliable, smooth operating actions. If I were buying something new now, I'd probably be looking at a Henry or Smith & Wesson or Marlin. Marlin's quality control for a number of years was pretty lousy. 30, 40 years ago, Marlin made strictly micro groove barrels, which were okay for accuracy with jacketed bullets, but known not to be, well, let's just say very finicky for using cast bullets. They eventually abandoned that micro groove, and now that Ruger has taken over Marlin, the ones that I've seen and the people I've talked to, the quality control has jumped up dramatically. So the Marlins are a very good option now. Henrys are great. The Smith & Wessons that I've used very in limited contact with are also excellent. If I were buying one now, I'd be buying one of those solid top receivers. One last mounting option I'll mention, I don't have one here with me, but 22 lever action, the Winchester 94-22, the Henrys, the Marlins. I have a very old Ithaca Model 72 saddle gun, which was actually made in West Germany. That was the first rifle I ever bought myself. They have a 22 dovetail rail on there for a little clamp-on scope mount, and you can get an aperture sight to fit on those. You just slide it on there, tighten it down, you got an aperture sight. The problem with those 22s is most of them have very low front sights, and a lot of these older weapons are the same way, so you're probably going to have to change the front sight to go with that aperture on a 22 dovetail sight. And I love the little 22 rifle, and they're great trainers. They're great for kids to mess around with. Just a lot of fun to go out and plink with. Backing up just a little bit, one thing I want to mention about tang sights. These have a lock ring. You can adjust it up and down for height, and then you can lock the ring so that it's not going to move on you. When Lyman first brought their tang sight back into production a few years ago, it did not have a lock ring. And it had kind of a O-ring in there to drag the up and down adjustment, but it was fairly easy for them to get rotated out of adjustment. So if you're going to go with a tang sight, make sure it has some kind of lock ring. This one has a knurled ring that you butt up and jam on this marbles. The marbles on the 44 model that my buddy set up, it has an Allen head set screw. So once you have the height adjustment you want, you lock it down with a set screw. The 44, I will show you, has this old marbles on the 44 has windage adjustment, so I can click it left and right, which is good because the front sight on this is not adjustable. It's a blade that's in a set square stud on the front of the barrel. It's pinned in place, so I can't adjust it left and right. So it's better to have that windage adjustment here on the back if you want. All of the marbles and Lymans that I've seen in current production have that windage adjustment. Now the one on my 357 here, this marbles does not have windage adjustment, but I'm lucky that I have a dovetail mount for this front sight, so I can drift it left and right for windage, adjust it up and down for elevation, and I'm okay. If you find an old rifle that's got a tank sight with no windage and you have a front sight that you can't adjust windage and you need some left and right adjustment, now you got a little work on your hands. You need to loosen up this tang sight and shim it and actually lean it over to the left or lean it over to the right with some shims under one side to adjust the windage. So that can get pretty complicated. Obviously, once you've got it sighted in, you lock it down and it's going to stay there for you. But with no windage adjustment in the back and no windage adjustment in the front, if that's what you're up against, then shimming that rear tang sight is your only way to go. Okay, front sights. I'll finish up here. Bead sights, they come in white, red, gold. They come flat faced, they come round faced. My experience, those rounded ones can catch light from different angles, and the actual center of the bead seems to move to my eyes. So I think the flat ones are probably better if you're going to use those bead sights. The aiming point for a bead sight is actually the center of the bead. So in other words, the bead is covering up what I want to hit on my target. Now at close range, that's not going to make that much of a deal. But if I'm out to 100, 150 yards, if I'm hunting with that carbine, that can get to be a deal. That's why I like that square top Patridge front sight. And the aiming point for that is just like on a military, like an M4 front sight. The aiming point is the very top edge of that flat-faced front sight. Very precise point on your target. And one of the best Patridge designs that was out there originally was called a sourdough sight. Straight, flat-topped. They generally had a little 45-degree angle on the top face that faced you. And they often had a little brass insert in there. And you could kind of take a little brasso and shine that thing up. And that 45-degree angle brass insert would catch the light and really make that thing stand out in a lot of different lighting conditions. Sourdough sights, to my knowledge, have not been made for a long time. A number of years ago, like the early 90s, I was at the Burris Scope Factory one day and I noticed that they had a box full of sights. Burris used to make iron sights. And I said, gee, have you got any old sourdough sights left? And they did, on a 3/8 dovetail base. And they had about 5 or 6 in different heights, was all they had left. So I bought them all. I bought them out of sourdough sights, and I've still got a couple in my box that have not made their way onto a carbine at one point or another. But those sourdough sights are not available. Now Skinner and XS, I believe Ranger Point Precision, there are several groups now that have that Patridge design, the narrow, flat-topped sight. Don't get one that's super thin, get one that's a little bit wider so that it's a little bit more visible to you. And most of them are just an angled, serrated surface now, so they look black. Skinner sights makes them in brass if you think that's cool, and brass might show up under some conditions where black sights would kind of blank out if you're hunting with them. What I have gone to on all three of these, I have the same sight on all three. On the 357, it happened to be a dovetail, so that's just a real simple drift in and out kind of operation. It's an angled face towards the shooter, and it has a white line right up the center. So you've got the black front sight, which shows up in most kind of conditions. You have that white stripe, which shows up in a lot of poor light conditions. And this is the most universal front sight I've ever used. This thing will show up on almost any kind of background, any kind of target. And I liked it so well that I got with XS and mounted them on these. Now both of these carbines, the 44 and the 4570, a lot of these Winchester carbines just have a kind of a rectangular steel base that is, I guess, welded on there. It is not adjustable. It has a slot through the center running fore and aft, and a blade goes in there. The original blade is really thin, kind of hard to see, so you can file that slot a little bit wider. XS can get you a sight that will mount down in there. It's held in with a roll pin through the side, so it's not going to go anywhere. The disadvantage is you have no windage adjustment on the front. So all three of these carbines have the same aperture sight, well mounted back towards my eye. They have that white line XS sight, so I've got the same sighting arrangement on all of these carbines. Skinner makes a front sight. As I said, they make brass, they make black in that Patridge design, a number of different heights for whatever you need. And a lot of times, if you go to a taller rear sight aperture, you're going to need a taller front sight to get them zeroed in properly. Skinner has one that is solid white. It doesn't have a white line down the middle, it's just a solid white front sight. And I think it's probably about as good as the XS white line. It's going to be visible under a lot of different hunting conditions. Whenever you're having to zero your sights, remember that whatever you do to the rear, if you want to move your group up, you move your rear sight up. Move it left, moves the group left. At the front, you got to do the opposite. If you want to move, if your rear sight is all the way down, but you can't get it any lower, your groups are still too high, then you need a taller front sight. Lower the rear sight or raise the front sight will bring the group down. Seems a little counterintuitive, but that's how you got to work it. You can file them, get them a little bit too tall, and you can file them down to the right height. It's better to get them kind of in the center of adjustment that you have available on the rear if you can. As I said, optics to me they're not the way I want to go on a lever action. Now where scopes do make sense to me on a lever action rifle are the new type of lever, well, they're not new. Browning has had one called the BLR, Browning lever action rifle, for quite some time. Henry has a couple of models. They have one called a Supreme and another called a Long Ranger. I believe the Supreme is in 223 or 556, and it's even magazine fed, M16 style magazines. But their Long Ranger or the Browning BLRs or the Winchester 95, the last of the Browning designed Winchester lever actions, those will fire modern rimless bottleneck cartridges like the 30-06. Those have the reach. They have the range to make shots out past 150 yards pretty easily. The 95 is an open top, so you're going to be very limited on what you can do with optics, but that Browning or the Henry rifles, they're solid tops. To me, they just scream out for a scope. But those are generally going to be more of a hunting rifle than a self-defense rifle. The lever action rifles are just incredibly popular nowadays, not only for nostalgia, but in my opinion, for very practical reasons. They deliver substantial power to 150 yards or a bit more when they're equipped with good aperture sights and Patridge square top front sights. They are fast, they're accurate, they're handy, they're rugged, and they're lightweight. And when you go to optics, the rugged and the lightweight part of that equation starts to fall off. And that's why, to me, optics are just not my thing on a lever action carbine. So far, no state has tried to ban them, even my home state for the time being of Illinois. Folks, if you like these videos, I hope you subscribe, you give me a thumbs up. Whatever you do, whatever you use to defend your life out there in terms of a long gun, make your choices wisely. Get it equipped for best effect. And then, instead of buying more gadgets to screw on it beyond sights and probably a light, invest your money in ammo and train with it and get good with it. And if you do, you're going to be somebody not to mess with a lever action carbine. Y'all be safe out there.
Okay, we got them both here now. You ready? Bud got one. Ginger got one. Uh-huh. Oh, she missed it. She usually gets them, doesn't she, bud? Okay, girl, last one. You ready? You ready? Yeah! That's all there is till next time.